Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. This is the second part of our two-part series of Grazing for Grassland Birds. We really hoped we'd be walking around Cresswell Oaks right now, walking around some cattle and out looking for Vesper sparrows and enjoying the sun, but that's not what happened. And so that's okay. We are here. And so our goal today is really, I think a lot of you joined for the first webinar. We tried to cover the basics there and kind of the background. And today we're going to talk, just get into implementation, cover some basics, but really just enough information that then we can open it up to questions and ask all those questions that you guys have about working with private landowners. If you are a private landowner, how you work with conservation partners, how you get started, what are the challenges, all those things. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Gary Slater from Ecostudies Institute and Bob Altman, and let them kind of remind folks and give some more information about the Oregon Vesper sparrow.
All right, thanks, Elspeth. So really, I'm just going to help get us started. I'm going to provide a pretty brief recap of some of the Oregon Vesper sparrow status and biology, and then Bob is going to jump in with a little bit more in-depth discussion about habitat needs for the sparrow, and that'll really hopefully set the stage for sort of this more in-depth conversation about how grazing and working lands can be used to create favorable habitat conditions for this bird. So next slide, Elspeth. So we're discussing the Vesper sparrow because it has seen these really long-term population declines and extensive range contractions across the breeding ground. And this is due to a lot of reasons that we all are aware of: habitat loss and degradation, many of the same things that are impacting a lot of our other grassland species. But in this slide, the figure on the left shows the historic range, and then the panel on the right shows the current range, and you can see pretty extensive range contraction, almost gone from Washington, except for a couple of populations. Overall, we think the population is about 3,000 individuals, and the largest remaining regional populations are found in the Umpqua Valley and the Willamette Valley. And in both of those regions, most of the individuals are on private lands, which is why private lands are so important to sort of long-term conservation and recovery. And in Willamette Valley, just as a note, about 66% of the individuals are found on pasture lands. So due to the declines in contraction, it's a species of concern by almost all conservation and federal state agencies. In Washington, the Vesper sparrow was recently listed as endangered. And then in Oregon, it's considered sensitive critical, which is really a subcategory that indicates imperiled with extinction. Next slide. And then as most of you know, the subspecies is currently being considered by Fish and Wildlife Service for listing under the Endangered Species Act. In 2018, the Fish and Wildlife Service published that the listing may be warranted, and this was a byproduct of a petition submitted by American Bird Conservancy and Bob Altman. Really, the next ongoing step is that the Fish and Wildlife Service will be working to complete and publish a species status assessment that is part of the decision-making process, whether to list or not to list, and that's due in late 2023. So we may not hear about that for a little while, anyways. So that gives us some time to start developing conservation strategies, particularly like we're talking about today on private lands. Next slide. A couple things to note about the species biology, which will help us in this discussion, is that it doesn't spend all of its time here in the Northwest. Part of the time, it is a short distance migrant, and so part of the time it's spending in the Central Valley of California during the non-breeding season. Like a lot of grassland birds, it nests on the ground, and it has a pretty variable diet that's composed of grass and forb seeds and insects, which are especially important during the breeding season when they're feeding developing young. And then the breeding season lasts from late April through the end of July. And this really means that our habitat management strategies are really trying to get those habitat conditions we're shooting for by April. And then following that, we're trying to minimize as much as possible activities that could impact those ground nesting activities. But we also know the Vesper sparrow can nest 2 or 3 times a year. And that can also be important for us to think about when aiming to create either early season or late season habitat. And so, ending on habitat, I'm going to pass it over to Bob to sort of talk about what specifically we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to go through fairly briefly, as Elspeth said, just hit some high points here because we're really going to focus on the discussion later on. But I want to talk a little bit about the habitat type, the habitat conditions. We've developed some metrics for that, as you can see in this slide. I want to show a series of about 7 or 8 slides that are photos of suitable habitat throughout its range, so you get a visual on what the habitat looks like, and then finish talking about what has changed in terms of what this bird evolved with from a habitat standpoint to what we have now out there, and then how grazing can play a role in providing those habitat conditions that we're targeting here. So this is really a bird of upland habitats, grassland and savanna habitats, and I'm using the term grassland here interchangeable with prairie if you're more familiar with that. But for those of you who are in the Willamette Valley, where there's a lot of wet prairie habitat and a lot of wet prairie restoration going on, this bird really doesn't select those areas. It prefers those upland or dry prairie grasslands. They don't need a huge area, but if you really want a population, you're looking at hundreds of acres, a few hundreds of acres, to have some semblance of a reasonable population that might be sustainable. I've seen them, and they do occur in smaller areas down to 20 acres, but 1 or 2 pairs is a fairly tenuous existence in those small places. So I tend to say we want to really shoot for at least 100 acres of suitable habitat to at least have a chance for a sustainable population. I sort of characterize their habitat really as structurally diverse, especially in the herbaceous and the ground layers. And that's going to come up frequently as we go through these slides looking at photos of Vesper sparrow habitat. So you can see some of the metrics we've come up with in terms of various aspects of that herbaceous layer and the tree and shrub layer. Of course, they don't want many trees and shrubs, but they do like some. You can see the numbers there, fairly small amount. The key with trees and shrubs is that they are scattered as opposed to in one large, dense clump. They do like, having structural diversity certainly is enhanced when you have higher forb cover. So we've got a metric for that. The height of the herbaceous vegetation, I like to use the numbers 6 to 18 inches as sort of a mean for this time of year. But certainly you can have, a certain amount below that or taller than that. And that's fine. Again, having that range is going to allow some of that structural diversity to exist. And then lastly, bare and sparsely vegetated ground is a real important factor for Vesper sparrow. And surprisingly, even for a lot of our grassland birds, we may not think of that part of it, especially when we think of things like savanna sparrow or grasshopper sparrow, or even western meadowlark. We tend to think of these large expansive grasslands. But when you get real in and start looking closely at those, there's a fair amount of sparsely vegetated ground that becomes real important, especially for foraging. And then lastly, you'll notice I didn't say anything here about native vegetation, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Certainly it's desirable. Certainly we all recognize the value of that, and certainly they evolved with that. But from the standpoint today, we find them in conditions where, the structure of the vegetation is more important really than the species composition. Next slide. So I'm going to start up north. This is in British Columbia. This is the last known site. This population is now gone. This is at Nanaimo Airport. Just a quick look, the things that jump out from what I just described: low stature, fairly larger areas of sparse vegetation, even some bare ground. Next slide. This is in the South Puget Sound. Notice it's more of a pure grassland, a little bit of bare ground. I don't really see much in the way of shrub cover out in the middle of that. But what they utilize in situations like this a lot is the trees on the edge. You see the oak trees to the right there and the firs in the background. The birds tend to focus along the edges of these types of grasslands where there's no additional structure out in the middle. Next slide. Also in the South Puget Sound, I think this is on Joint Base Lewis McChord. You got a little bit of everything going on here from what I described, from the bare ground up to the shrub layer. And again, notice, non-native shrubs there, certainly. Next slide. Down in the Willamette Valley, this is some pasture land. This is a gradient from really grassland, pure grassland in the foreground, I should say, moving into some savanna and even into some open woodland in the background there. But this is regularly used by the birds. Next slide. A fir savanna, also in the Willamette Valley. Pretty much low statured grass would be the thing that jumps out at me here. This actually is a prairie restoration site. One of the few places where we actually have Vesper sparrows in prairie restoration. Next slide. If I was in the eastern United States, I'd call this the beginnings of an old field. It's pasture land that has been fallowed for probably a couple years, and it's starting to succeed into potentially a shrubland, but it's still at this stage is very much suitable habitat for Vesper sparrows with scattered shrubs and small trees and the low statured grass. Next slide. Similar situation in the Willamette Valley, a large expanse of pasture land, and repeating the similar structure we've seen elsewhere. Next slide. Now down in the Umpqua Valley, this particular ranch has the highest density that I'm aware of Oregon Vesper sparrows, and it's got a little bit of everything in terms of habitat conditions. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Elspeth. This is another picture of the same site. Not only do you get structural diversity here, you get topographic diversity. I mean, there's just a lot of little nooks and crannies, as I would call them, up draws and little creeks, and just a good mixture of habitat for the birds. And then next slide. Just another photo, same location, but I wanted to show more here, a little bit more in terms of sparsely vegetated areas, some bare ground that results from the road going through there. Next slide. The only population I know of on the southern Oregon coast is in pasture lands. This is South of Bandon, extremely high topographic relief, but otherwise looks pretty typical for the birds. Next. Down in the Klamath Mountains, they're mostly found up in montane meadows. This is outside of Ashland, and this is out in the middle of the meadow. There's more structural diversity on the edges of the meadow, but low stature jumps out pretty quickly to me as I look at this. Next slide. Another montane meadow in the Klamath Mountains, a little different here though. South facing, thin, shallow soils, low stature, sparsely vegetated, and very rocky, but yet also has the, scattered shrubs and small trees. And next one. And this is the last visual, and this one's a little different. This is actually down in northwestern California, north of Crescent City. This is the last place that they were known to occur in California up until about 15 or 20 years ago. But this is coastal dune habitat that has been invaded by a fair amount of vegetation and shrubs. And the reverse occurred here. That invasion actually resulted in creating suitability from what would typically in coastal dune habitat would not be suitable. So next slide. So what's changed? The question always comes up, well, these birds evolved with native prairies, and now you're saying that these pasture lands are providing suitable habitat, and the cows are important for maintaining that suitable habitat. Well, this is sort of what I've gleaned from talking with plant ecologists and reading and talking to a variety of other people, that a lot of these upland native grasslands were more naturally lower statured and more structurally diverse. And they had a lot of bunch grasses, and those bunch grasses tend to create interstitial spaces between the bunches, that those interstitial spaces often become the places that were naturally sparsely vegetated. And of course, what has happened, as we all know, with the invasion of very aggressive non-native grasses and forbs, particularly grasses, where their MO is simply to grow fast, grow tall, grow dense, and outcompete the natives. And so that's what really has caused this conversion from suitable native grassland habitat for the bird to what has become in a lot of places, not everywhere, but a lot of places, just simply too tall and too dense. And that takes it out of suitability for Vesper sparrows when it gets too tall and too dense. Next slide. So grazing, as it turns out, we're finding, most of the population is in pasture land, and grazing seems to be able to basically put a dent in that height and density of the vegetation, knock it back down, create structural, cows will high grade, they'll eat certain things, they'll leave certain things, where they walk, where they lay, all of those things contribute to creation of structural diversity, and perhaps even more importantly, some sparsely vegetated and bearish ground areas. That can be very difficult to achieve if you're trying to go through a normal sort of prairie restoration, where in fact, usually you don't want those types of bearish ground areas. So it just works well in this situation that the cows create these habitat conditions that the birds like. So what we're finding is that we know, back up one there, please, Elspeth. What we're finding is that we know that grazing can achieve suitable habitat, and what we're also seeing is that it can be done under a variety of different grazing regimes. This is not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation, and we're going to hear a little bit later from some examples of how, you know, shorter rotations, more intense grazing, but shorter rotations. Some places do longer rotations, fewer animals. There's a variety of ways, I think, to get to this, the conditions that the birds like. And a lot of it's going to depend upon the local situation with the soils, the vegetation, and certainly, as we found out this year, environmental conditions, weather events. So I think the key thing is to recognize that various grazing regimes can get us to where we want to be for this bird, and we need to certainly have some flexibility in recognizing that even on an annual basis, that may change. We may have to make some adjustments just based on local conditions. So that's all I wanted to talk about for now, and I think we'll just move on. Or I don't know how you want to do it, Elspeth, whether there's questions or not. But certainly, hopefully, we've brought up some topics that raise some questions with folks, and we can get into those later.
Yeah, we'll definitely have time for more questions later, but if anyone has some really Vesper sparrow or bird specific questions they want to ask now, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Okay, not seeing any raised hands, so I think we'll keep going and have an opportunity for questions in just a bit. So thank you so much, Bob and Gary, for going over more details about the Vesper sparrow and birds and how that interacts with these habitat needs and cattle, you know, the habitat that cattle produce. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that translates to, you know, some plans, like tangible plans that you're working with when you're trying to implement conservation on these working lands. And so as before, I will use Derek's property, who he'll speak in just a bit, Cresswell Oaks, as the example. So you've got this, you've got these habitat types, you've got where you want to do restoration, you want to conserve, you're also grazing, and those do overlap. And so we're talking about kind of how do you manage that? How do you feel comfortable with that? And what are the really important things to keep in mind as you combine these two things? So first Tom Snyder from NRCS and Jared Jabusik from Fish and Wildlife Partners will speak in a bit, and Tom will follow up on this if there are questions. But a good place to start is just a pasture condition. NRCS can come out and you can find the resources on their website. I'll share them after. And just it's a good benchmark, and it's something you can do throughout the season, and it's certainly a little subjective, but it gives you a good sense for where you need to improve your pasture overall, and that's before you even get into parameters to make it really bird friendly. And that just looks at the desirable plants, percent of legumes, live plant cover, plant diversity, soil cover, utilization, severity, like what are the conditions of the livestock concentration areas, soil compaction, plant vigor, and erosion. And so it's just a good starting place if you're thinking about a property, getting kind of into thinking about how you can improve its habitat, you know, conservation values. This is a good starting point. And then you have to have a grazing plan. That's going to go over stocking rates and the periods, typical pasture rotation. It's going to outline the fences and the roads and the trails that exist on your property and how they might interact with this. You're going to highlight rare species and their needs and any details about that. Talk about additional management tools, herbicide, other things you might be doing on the property, and some oversight and review. And depending on what kind of type of partnership you have, whether it's a conservation easement or just a management agreement, you might have different levels of this. But how will we keep an eye on this, and who's reviewing this? Ideally, you're having some conservation partners. Ideally, NRCS is looking at it and saying, yeah, like this sounds good to us. And then with that grazing plan, what are the things that you really want to keep in mind? You want to identify your goals and your priorities. And so, for instance, Derek's grazing plan that we put together once we had the conservation easement, identified, we want this to support Vesper sparrow, we want it to support conservation values, we want it to support the economics of the family's operation, cattle operation. And so how do we make sure we've identified what do we want to accomplish, and then how are we going to do that? You want to be flexible. You're always going to need to respond to grass height, soil condition, and the needs of rare species. So you're not going to write some prescription of, okay, on May 12th, we're going to move them to this pasture. On May 14th, we'll move them here. It's not that prescriptive. You have to have guidance so that you're saying, okay, when we have this grass height, when we have this soil, if, depending on breeding season, et cetera, that's kind of what's guiding your decisions and the rancher's decisions on the ground. And you absolutely have to be adaptive. And I think we'll hear about that a bit more today. Certainly this year has been a really tough, in the Willamette Valley has been really tough with drought and a lot of wind. And so you always have to be able to respond to the environmental conditions of whatever's happening. And so I think something that's really important when we talk about this is grazing is such a great way to achieve suitable habitat for Vesper sparrow. And as we merge these working lands with these conservation objectives and these, these prescriptions, these plans, et cetera, they have to be flexible. You have to have trust. You have to have good communication with your rancher. They have to trust you. You have to trust them, et cetera, because there are so many things that come up from so many directions, and you have to be flexible. And so then how does that grazing plan then translate to a management plan? And I think I went over this in the last webinar, but in our management plan, we just, one of our objectives is to maintain or increase Vesper sparrow populations. And so that, outlines that mean grass height of 6 to 20 inches, has the timing, talks about reducing farm operations during the peak nesting periods, things like that. So here's a beautiful shot of Crestwell Oaks. Wish we could all be there right now, but someday we'll do that. And I'm gonna hand it over to Derek, who is a total pro, and he and his family managed this property with love and a lot of hard work, and they're a great partner to conservation. And I'm going to just let Derek talk a little bit about what it's like to run cattle, how it's changed a bit now that he's working with Vesper sparrows, and just kind of some of the challenges that come along with things you got to keep in mind when you're running cattle. So with that, Derek, I'm going to hand it over to you.
If I push the mute button right, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Elsbeth and Bob and Gary. You have a lot to cover the habitat that we're looking for. I will focus a little bit since I'm not a scientist. I mean, I'm a working lands manager with my children and my grandchildren, 3 generations of us on this property. We settled on stalkers or yearling cattle here about 25 years ago after 5 years of trying to have cows and calves. And we didn't know anything about a Vesper sparrow until about 6 years ago. And my first teacher was a man named Bob Altman. So I went from knowing nothing to having arguably the best teacher you could have to learn about it. And we're thankful for that. Unbeknownst to us, we'd been creating habitat like Bob described, Elsbeth described. We'd been creating that kind of habitat by accident, just being honest. But it happens that the management of the grass to maximize our investment here works for Vesper sparrow too. So now we find ourselves in a position where we're working with a number of partners. This is a good point for me to I'm going to speak to the people that are here, I hope, that have cattle, that are curious about what's it like to work with these agencies. Is it easy? Is it hard? Is it impossible? And I want to tell you that 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I was nervous about even letting an agency on the ranch for fear that they would find some endangered species and we would lose our ability to operate and try to make a profit. And I will say profit often to remind people that that's a necessary piece or element as an operator to cooperate and help with conservation values. We have to be sustainable economically as well. And now I joke when we put 1,600 acres in a permanent conservation easement in partnership with the BPA and CNLM 3 years ago now, I guess it is. And that was a journey, but the agencies to work with, I can tell you from FSA, NRCS, Tom Snyder, who's on this today. Tom Snyder has been absolutely amazing in helping us, not just to manage for Vesper sparrows, but manage for grass. And we have timberlands here as well. And Tom has been a tremendous resource in both of those areas. CNLM, Saunders is the on the ground guy there that we work with, and he too has been tremendous. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Jared Jabusik, has helped us. We've been doing oak restoration projects. Those also help Vesper sparrows. We thin edges of these oak woodlands that we have back and thin those trees out and create more habitat. Obviously, OWEB, BPA, even Oregon Department of Forestry has been helpful, Bob Altman. All that to say, for us, working with these agencies, they haven't made it harder for us. They've made it easier for us. They've educated us. They've helped to fund things that not only help in conservation values, but they also have helped and added value to our grazing practices here. And that's just been a huge, pleasant surprise over the last 6 years working with these agencies. You know, and before I forget, I just want to invite anybody that is in the cattle business or forestry business that wants to talk with a landowner that's been immersed in this stuff for a few years now. Elsbeth will share my contact information, and I'm always happy to talk with other landowners and share our experience honestly and to try to help you navigate this. So that offers on the table for you as well. For us, the Vesper sparrow, we didn't realize what we were doing and how well it was helping the Vesper sparrow. So now that we know about it, some mornings I feel like it's made it harder for me. But we manage the uplands. We try to graze those early in the season so that by May the birds come in and they find those conditions that Bob and Elsbeth described when they get here, and they start getting here middle of May. And so we graze that off early, which is good because we stay off some of our wetter pastures. And I won't go off in a, no pun intended, the weeds on the details here, but it really hasn't made things harder. We use a single wire electric hot fence to segregate our pastures further, which is also good for managing the grass. So it's good for the Vesper sparrows, it's good for the cattle. And we've gotten pretty good with a single wire. And that's been a really good tool. There's a series of videos on YouTube, and this again is for the producers out there or people that are curious about it. A gentleman named Greg Judy, and he has a lot of videos that address. He's a rancher, and he grazes not only cattle but sheep, and just does a great job. And we've learned a lot watching him. We're going to develop some new watering sites this year. I'm speaking optimistically because we're going to drill a couple of wells and we're going to solar power those and develop more watering stations so we can be even more prescriptive. I'll use that word for our grazing here and break paddocks up more. I know Matt is going to talk some about their location up north of us, and they've got a really good operator up there, and I've appreciated looking at what they're doing as well. I'm not a scientist, and I like doing the questions with people more than just trying to anticipate what it is that you want to hear. But I would say, again, I'll reiterate, the agencies have been very, very positive to work with. And they've helped us pay for things that we would never be able to do out of a cash flow from what we do. The cattle don't generate enough, and so they've stepped up and they've helped us, and that's been wonderful because it does benefit cattle as well. And they understand that we have to adapt. This year's a great example. The weather has just been much drier than normal, and I feel like we're a month to 6 weeks ahead, or to put it another way, it's like conditions here are first part of June versus, first part early May. And so that's added some challenges, but it didn't affect Vesper sparrows or what we do to help the Vesper sparrows at all. It's just the grass. In fact, I think conditions for Vesper sparrows here are probably might be ideal right now. And with that, I think I will add one more thing, and it's about this. So far, the conversation has been about the conditions on the ground and the challenges of managing those things, or just the process of managing them. Not necessarily a big challenge, but that's what we do and we love to do it. But there's a whole nother side of this that has to work, and that's for us, because we run yearlings. We have to go buy cattle, and we have to be able to buy them at the right prices, and we have to be able to ship them and get them here, and we have to be able to market them, and that all happens between the first of the year and the middle of July. And so that is a variable. There could be a season where the market is so tough. Can we buy cattle to stock here to keep grass short? And so that's just a whole nother layer for us as operators that we have to navigate and manage. I'm thankful we've developed long-term relationships with people that run feedlots in Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon. And so that's really helped us to be consistent, stable producers here. But that is something that people need to understand. It's not just on the ground managing the grass. We also have to manage the economics of this. And sometimes that can be as big a challenge as anything. So again, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Elspeth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Derek. So we're going to turn now to Matt Blakely-Smith from Greenbelt Land Trust, and he's going to talk about kind of the other side of things of a conservation organization with a conservation property and bringing cattle on to help as a management tool. And they also have a great population of Vesper sparrow. So with that, Matt, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Matt Blakely-Smith with Greenbelt Land Trust, and here's our property up outside of Corvallis, Bald Hill Farm. It was purchased in 2013 with funding from the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program, OWEB, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as our community here. There was a lot of donations from our members and supporters. With that comes a lot of opinions and directives on how you should manage your property. And that has been one of the challenges, but also one of the opportunities, because so many people over the years have come to our property and given us advice. Probably at least 10 of you on this call have probably visited Bald Hill and told us what to do. So one of the things that a lot of folks, before we purchased the property, it was grazed almost year-round, very intensively, and I think a lot of people thought it was overgrazed. And so the first thing, the biologist came, and I'm the biologist, but and a lot of folks said, you need to pull back on the grazing, it's way overgrazed. So what did we do? We kind of put on the brakes, and before that, we had a great population of Vesper sparrows, and Bob can talk about this later, but essentially we stopped grazing at that high intensity, and a lot of the birds abandoned the site. The conditions were not right, the grass was too tall, and here we are. Conservation to the rescue, kind of destroyed or didn't manage the property to support those birds. So we had to kind of start over and change how we do things. And really, for a lot of, this is similar to a lot of properties we've worked on for endangered species like Fender's blue butterfly and lupins and limatium. A lot of them need that early seral condition, a lot of disturbance and management. So how do we, for Vesper sparrows, it's different because literally you don't do management for one season and they may not occupy your site. For other endangered species, you might have 5 years. So it's a really dramatic change. So we talked about, just want to talk about successful grazing on a property. And Derek started getting into this, but really it's, in many ways, it's not about the cows, it's about the people. It's about your relationship with the rancher and the producer. And being a land manager, being a biologist, I have gotten into the habit of hiring crews to do weed sprays, to go mow fields, and being very demanding of those people and treating them like contractors and say, like, go spray that field. And if they kill your lupin, then you fire them. And you find somebody else. But with grazing, it doesn't work that way. With grazing, you don't have a lot of options for people who you're going to work with. So building that relationship is probably the most critical part. I've been working a lot on our grazing plan, and everybody wants to know about stocking density, type of animals, how tall the grass is going to be. Those are all very important things, but you can't get there without a relationship with your grazer and having that ability to work with them to make those changes, because effectively what you're asking somebody to do is alter their business to meet your needs. And so I don't want to belabor this, but we talk about cows, but really this is management of relationships that we're talking about. And Derek also got into this a little bit, just talking about if we're trying to figure out how to make this work on your property, just recognizing the considerations that a lot of us that have kind of 9-to-5 jobs, that have regular paychecks coming in. If you find that farmers and ranchers are a little bit ornery and a little bit challenging to deal with, we need to recognize that financial aspect. And Derek already talked about it, but they work in a very volatile environment, and it's their livelihoods at stake. And the price of corn in Kansas dictates the price that they are able to buy and sell their cattle and their profitability, which is not something that they have any power over. And so they're living in this really challenging environment, and they can't control much because beef is a global commodity. So we need to, again, recognize that and recognize that the relationship is incredibly important. So these are just, I'm rambling a little bit, some things just to talk about things that we do that I think is important is to recognize the terms of the lease, recognizing how long you can, from a business perspective, a rancher needs predictability. Every business needs long-term predictability, and having a year-to-year lease is not very stable for anybody. So having, if you can, the longer the lease, the better. Obviously, you need terms in there to make changes. But if you have just a year-to-year lease, you're incentivizing what we call mining of resources, that somebody's going to come in and just take as much as they can. There's no commitment to the property. So recognizing that longer-term leases gives a rancher business stability, which is what everybody really needs in the end. Just jumping from different topics, and then having a rancher that really has a diversified operation can be really helpful. And what I mean by that is that that they're not just dependent on your one property. We work with Ryan Cheek, and he has cattle on a number of properties. And so if one area is drying down and he needs more grazing opportunities, he can move cattle from one property to another. If you're working with a smaller operator that only has your one property, there's not that flexibility sometimes to be able to adjust to the changing conditions. Maybe it's a wet year and your grass is growing really fast. They need to bring in more animals to knock it down. So just thinking about, again, your relationship with that rancher. And again, the name of the game for most of us is flexibility. Elspeth brought this up. We're lucky in that we have some upland, we have some wetland, we have a barn to keep some animals in early spring when they're just arriving, and we can feed them on hay before we let them out into the fields. But having habitat flexibility to working has been really helpful for us. And then let's, one last thing, just talking about conservation to the rescue. One of the things that a lot of us have done in the past is think we get a new property and we think we know the best thing to do is to rip out those old fences that are a threat to wildlife, and certainly some of them are. But in order to have a successful grazing operation, you need infrastructure. You can't operate without fences and water. And NRCS and Tom Snyder have been incredibly vital to us to get those resources installed on the property and maintained and helped pay for them. But again, sometimes our first inclination is to remove that infrastructure before we've made good decisions. Next slide, please. It's not all grazing can be challenging. This is, again, Bald Hill Farm. Things are constantly breaking. Things aren't always perfect. I think our valve to the water trough broke. Of course, it's going to break on the weekend when nobody's around. And it spilled for two days, and things got really messy and muddy. And this is, as an ecologist, you see this and you get a little upset because this is not what you want on your property, especially a visible property. But we need to let go of some of those perfectionist ideals and recognize in a ranching operation, there's going to be some mistakes, and some water lines are going to break, fences are going to break, animals are going to escape, and you know what? They're going to eat your favorite plant that you have been watching for 6 weeks. There's going to be some challenges. Overall, the outcome for us has been incredibly positive. So I don't want to leave you on this note of this muddy mess. I do want you to recognize that cattle grazing isn't going to solve all of your problems. It's been very positive for us. One of the things to recognize, again, Derek talked about this, is the finances. We don't make much money on this at all. In fact, when you take into consideration the monitoring that we do, paying for our electricity and our bills, we're probably losing money on this, but we think it's beneficial overall for the habitat to continue to graze. And so that's why we do it. The economics for the land trust that owns the property, we're subsidizing this work in the end. And I think it's what we get out of it, the product we're getting, are Vesper sparrow habitat and other wildlife habitat. And so just recognizing again that the market, the financial part is incredibly important to consider, and it cuts both ways on this. That's all I have for now.
Great, thanks so much. So we're gonna, our last two presenters are Tom Snyder from NRCS and Jared Jabusik, and they're gonna just give some insights of, they both work so closely with landowners and provide all sorts of services, technical, financial, and so just gonna give some of their perspectives, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Elspeth. I don't have any slides today. I was just going to visit with y'all for a bit. One thing though I thought was really interesting listening to the presenters, Gary and Bob and Derek and Matt, is what's good for Oregon Vesper sparrow is also good for pastures and ultimately good for livestock. So I think one of the simplest things you can do is to establish a prescribed grazing rotation so that you're rotating those pastures. And if you think about that, a typical rotation is about 30 days or so off of a pasture. That seems pretty common with most people. So you think about that, all your animals are in one pasture. So that's, 80% or better of your ranch that has no livestock on it for an extended period of time, usually at least 30 days or so. So with our talking about our grazing rotation, so introduced pasture grasses to maintain the vigorous grass in the pasture. You want to not graze any shorter than 3 or 4 inches. And this is something interesting to me that I didn't realize. You think about root reserves and sugars in the roots to promote future growth. Well, grass is different. Grass stores those sugars for future growth in the bottom 3 inches of the stem. So by overgrazing, you're hurting your grass, you're reducing your yields, and ultimately the forage that is available. Also, by overgrazing, there are some species that are more adapted to overgrazing than others. So you've got your nice pasture, it's got some fescue, it's got some orchard grass, it's got perennial ryegrass. Maybe you've got some vetch and clover and plantain, or whatever else is out there. That's my botanist, I see she's on this call, she calls it cow chow. So there's a number of forbs that are still good cow chow. By overgrazing, what you're doing is you're getting a lot of those things dropping out of the mix, because bent grass can tolerate being grazed super short, and that's why they use bent grass on golf greens, because they can persist in that situation. So if you find yourself dominated by bent grass, it's probably because that other grass is no longer able to compete, and the bent grass is the only thing that can tolerate those situations. Similarly, your clover and your vetch drops out of the mix, and you find yourself with false dandelion and Queen Anne's lace, which neither are great nectar resources for pollinators. And so, from a grazing standpoint, that diversity in there, you're improving the protein content, you're turning grass and legumes into beef or sheep, or, whatever you're grazing out there. But it's also, you think about that diversity, and the insects and the pollinators, they're going after those flowering plants. That's what's attracting them to the property. And then those insects, those pollinators, are also what's at the bottom of the food chain. And so the grassland birds are also eating those insects. And I find a lot more diversity. A grass-dominated stand, the grass doesn't produce nectar sources like flowering plants do. So having those flowering plants in there, you're improving the protein content, but you're also improving the bottom of the food chain that's supporting all the diversity, both plant and animal diversity, that's on those pastures. So in the springtime right now, so in a grazing rotation, you want to keep grass from going to seed, because if you keep it vegetative and keep it from trying to reproduce, you get more forage production. When you let it go to seed, the grass thinks it's done its job and it's going to sign out for the rest of the year, and you won't get any more grass until you get your fall rains. So that also fits in with what Bob was saying about forage height, because you think about grass, by the time it goes to seed, you're getting 18 inches or more, but maintaining it between 4 and 18 inches, you're improving your forage and, again, improving Vesper sparrow habitat. So Elspeth talked about our pasture condition score sheet, and it's a really good tool. It is somewhat subjective. If me and 5 other people went out and did this, we're going to get 5 different answers. But what's consistent is if the same person keeps evaluating each of those metrics, then you can start to track the trends in your pasture. Are you maintaining your legume? Are you seeing more bent grass dominate? Are you maintaining your forage heights? Do you see concentration areas? So that's all good stuff to be aware of. And after you do, you know, half a dozen, 10 pasture condition score sheets, you can walk out there and kind of tick them off mentally and just be able to evaluate visually, you know, what's going on or what's happening. And then also stocking rates, you know, really there's no good way to set a stocking rate other than to put cows out there and watch your pastures. But what I like to use for a starting point is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. And if you go through those reports, it will tell you what the potential yield is for a soil type. And one thing to keep in mind is that the Web Soil Survey is optimum, best case scenario. You know, you've got perfect fertilization, you're maintaining the vegetative productivity of that pasture. I mean, you're totally dialed in. And I've seen some fabulous operations, and Derek's is one of them, but I haven't seen an operation where I felt like it was 100% total maximum productivity. So as you're looking at those numbers, where I start with most people is about 50% of what the Web Soil Survey suggests. So if you're starting at 50%, it's pretty conservative. You're able to watch your cows and say, oh, you know what, I had a little more grass this year. Maybe we could bump that number up. And so the Web Soil Survey is a good starting place, but nothing replaces actually going out and watching your pastures and seeing how they grow. I mean, that's what you really need to do. But the Web Soil Survey is a good starting place. And the units in Web Soil Survey is a little bit confusing to folks who aren't in the middle of grazing and all that. It's in the yield unit is in animal unit months. So an animal unit month is how much 1,000 pounds of grazing animal eats in 30 days. It's 780 pounds of air-dried forage. So that's several sheep, or maybe a cow-calf is a little over an animal unit, but that's what those units are. It's animal unit months. So you can just figure out how much your animals weigh. Every 1,000 pounds is an animal unit. And then using that Web Soil Survey, that's a good starting point. I think that's what come to mind, Elspeth, as everybody was speaking today. So I'd be happy to turn this over to Jared or take questions.
Perfect. That seems great. Let's turn it over to Jared, and then we'll just be able to open the floor to questions for everyone.
All right, I'm unmuted, I think. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So you all, most of you probably know I'm prone to going off topic and being long-winded and rambling. So just mute me when you've had enough. The reason I'm going off topic is because not all of our producers have Vesper sparrows, and there's still a lot of utility in grazing for other kinds of birds and pollinators and flowers. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit. We've established that vegetative structure is important, and managing vegetative succession is important for open grasslands and savannas and woodlands, anything that that needs some sort of disturbance regime. But I'm going to get into the weeds just a little bit further. A diverse native plant community means more bugs, which means more birds. If you have a low diversity plant community, let's say 100 acres supports 3 pairs of whatever bird you want. But maybe with a diverse plant community, you might end up with 6 pairs in the same area. So if you want a diverse plant community, I hope you can't hear that cat that's yowling in the background. it's distracting for me, but I hope you guys can't hear it. So if you want a diverse plant community, at some point you got to let the natives bloom and set seed, and that takes rotation, and it might perhaps a longer rotation than what you might want for forage management. So in some places this might work for producers, but in some places it might not work great, or it might work in some parts of a ranch. So what we found is separating pastures into habitat units is probably the first most important step, and most of the time you're already doing that. There's areas with productive soils where the non-native grasses are most competitive and the native plant communities are pretty much gone. Then there's the upland areas where the soils get, when they become poor, natives are more competitive. And there's a suite of native species that do better there. And then there's wet areas. Like Derek said, a lot of the time you're keeping the livestock out of there until later in the spring so you don't muck up the soil or anything like that. But there's a suite of natives like, say, camas that do really well there. So they do well there, especially if you can manage the grasses. So in Benton County, we've had a lot of success where we have the productive soils kind of be the bread and butter, if you will. We're all also working with Ryan Cheek on several projects there. And so a lot of times we utilize early grazing on the shallow upland soils and then pull animals out of there for basically the rest of the spring and let the natives bloom and set seed. Then during that time, the natives in the wet areas are, a lot of them start blooming. And we keep that area separate and let them bloom and set seed. And then when we bring the livestock in later, they take off the grass, but they also grind that seed into the soil with their hooves, provided the seed is ready to hit the ground. And you can basically keep them there as long as you want. The more the grass they eat, the better, and the more they grind that seed into the soil is better. And some of the nicest prairies I've seen in the Willamette Valley are managed this way. And so anyhow, we've had a lot of success doing that, but you still need infrastructure. You still need a big enough bread and butter area that the livestock can put on weight. If you're not putting on weight, it's not going to work. And you still need flexibility for when you're moving animals from one place to another. So even if you don't have Vesper sparrows and you're trying to manage for native plants, there is still a lot of common ground to be had there. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about some of the things I've seen. So I'll stop there if
Great.
that's okay.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So I just want to just say huge thank you so that I don't get lost at the end to all of the folks who have presented. I really appreciate everyone who has joined, and I want to acknowledge Cornell Lab of Ornithology for funding this. And with that, we have a lot of time for questions. So again, thank you everyone for presenting. And now everyone who's been listening, hit us with your questions, please. Just raise your hand and I'll say your name and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Don't be shy. Okay, Saunders, go ahead.
This is Saunders Freed with CNLM. Hi, everybody. My question is, because I'm new to this grazing with conservation as well. And one of the things I've always wondered about is, I know there's never a perfect answer to anything, but perhaps Jared has a good idea. What's the what % native works well for cattle production? Because I know, non-native grasses is typically what ranchers prefer, and lots of them for production. But like, how much native can we get established in these grazed pastures and still promote productivity and keep things economically viable?
Well, I guess the short answer is I'll take what I can get. Every little bit helps. So that's one way to dodge the question. The other thing is a question of timing. So if you can, you can actually have quite a bit of native plants, provided you've got the area to move the livestock back into. So the idea is that you're utilizing areas that don't produce a whole lot of forage anyway. So I guess I tend to think of it in terms of management units. You've got the area that there's not a lot of forage. Those are the areas that you manage for that, or the wet prairie areas where a lot of the plants you've got in there can persist with some of these non-native grasses, and just focus a little bit more on the timing there. And it's okay for part of the year to have a ton of blooming plants, and then after that the grasses kind of take over and get taller. But the native plants have to be fairly tenacious and long-lived and deep-rooted to hang in there. So it provided the producers willing to move animals in, specifically in the upland areas, if they're willing to move them in and move them out pretty quickly, they can still get enough forage to put a little bit of weight on, but it just might not last very long, and they have to get them back out to the areas that have the higher quality forage.
Great.
Can I add to what Jared said a little bit?
Please do.
So with native grasses, the growth point is higher than the pasture grasses. So you can't graze them as low. That 3 to 4 inches I said for the pasture grasses, it's more like 6 to 8 inches for the native grass. And like Jared said, it's all in the timing. So the introduced pasture grasses, make a even standard grass. Our native grasses are pretty clumpy with that interstitial space that Bob was talking about. So they just don't produce as much forage as the grasses that have been developed over years, focused on nice wide leaf blades and lots of forage. Like Jared said, it's all in the timing in the springtime when everything's going crazy. Cows like grass, and they're gonna target grass over a lot of the flowering plants, and then knocking that grass back gives those flowering plants a chance to take off. I would not encourage somebody who is trying to make a living with livestock to plant their pasture to native grass, because it's not as productive. But what I do try to do is encourage folks, that hillside where you don't have much going on anyway is a great place to try to focus on native habitat, because the grazing value isn't as high in those areas, and being opportunistic, like Jared said, with an eye on economics and understanding these people got to make a living and pay taxes and feed their children and all that, looking for where those opportunities kind of balance one another.
And in terms of my answer, what I had in mind was an area that still had a lot of non-native grasses in it. They're just going to be less vigorous and maybe don't cover all of the ground. yeah, if you've got native grasses, it just might not be an area that you're going to be able to keep them in very long at all, if at all.
Anyone else want to add to that? Bob?
Nope.
Okay.
I did want to just say one thing, kind of following up on what Tom was starting to get into, and maybe it's a different topic, but a lot of other regions in the country have calculated kind of the forage quality for each individual species of grass. And the Willamette Valleys, we're such a small little ecozone here that there's just huge amounts of data gaps. And I think there's thinking of all the sorts of possibilities. One thing that would be really beneficial is just to do some of those pilot studies where we do calculate forage quality of some of our different species. And something like Romer's fescue is so similar to Idaho fescue that probably that data exists, but from a standpoint of how it actually is functioning in the Willamette Valley, I think is missing. But Tom, can you talk about that a little bit more, just about the forage quality?
So you're coming at it, Matt, from a real scientific approach. And, you know, my job is based in science, but a lot of it's just anecdotal or looking, you know, when you're looking at forage quality, looking at the plant itself, does it have wide leaf blades? Is there a lot of forage there, or is it all stems and seeds? So like blue wild rye, for example, has got a lot of forage. It's got a nice wide leaf blade, but Romer's fescue has a real narrow leaf blade. It just doesn't have as much pounds per acre worth of forage. But if you look at an orchard grass or a tall fescue or even perennial rye, I mean, those leaf blades are like a ½ inch wide, you know, and there's a lot of them, and that is where you're getting that forage productivity. So maybe not, I couldn't give an answer like on a species by species, but if we're out walking in the pasture, you can look and go, okay, that is really good forage, high quality. And that's the same with bent grass. You know, bent grass gets that tall stem with the seed on top, and they have like a couple little leaf blades at the bottom. I mean, it just doesn't produce a lot of forage. If you just look at, you know, what people want for a typical pasture grass, it's just looking at that volume of forage out there, and you don't have those spaces. It's an even mat across the field.
Elspeth, I can add a little bit.
Sure.
So one of the things that seems to be emerging here is this idea of partitioning out, perhaps in a more traditional sense, where pastures a lot of times were just large, were maybe designed or set up based on convenience, roads or some other features out there. But one of the things that I've noticed with Vesper sparrows, and I'm actually hearing from a couple other folks here, especially Jared and Tom, is this idea of partitioning those oftentimes larger pastures out for perhaps different objectives and managing them a little differently to be able to try and maximize your integration of conservation values and forage. And that's, you know, that's exactly what I am seeing from a Vesper sparrow perspective is needed in a lot of these places, because a lot of these properties that I work on, in fact, I'm trying to think, just about all of them are foothillish for the most part, and they have a mixture of upland dry grassland and lower, you know, wet prairie. And oftentimes, sometimes it's a particular field that is all one. Like if it's on the low end of the property, I think at Derrick's, as soon as you come in the drive there and to the south, that's mostly all wet prairie. But yet a lot of the rest of the property has this mixture of upland and patches of wet prairie in between. And so one of the things that we're started to do at Derrick's this year is to basically re-fence some of these paddocks, separating out upland, and just as a starting point, separating out upland and wetland. I mean, you could obviously do some finer subdivisions of that based on things that like Jared was talking about, but just as a starting point, upland versus wetland. And trying to get the cows in there in March to really knock that upland down in the upland part. And then Tom mentioned the sort of the typical standard 30-day interval between rotations, getting back to pastures. I know Derek might have, I think his rotations are perhaps a little bit faster than that, but he could talk to that. But even if the 30-day interval is pretty convenient, because that is basically the length of time for a nesting cycle for one pair. I mean, right around 30 days. So if we have the opportunity to get the habitat in the right condition, the uplands, the birds come in. At that point, the cows are getting moved off and they're starting to move down into maybe some of the wetter areas that are starting to dry up. And if they're down there for, 30 days or whatever, then you have a cycle of, the birds are up in that upland area and they can probably pull off a nesting attempt in before the next rotation comes in. And of course, the same would be true on the other end of the wetter parts of the pasture too, once the cows get out of those and move back into the uplands. So I think there's, you really have to do it on a site-specific basis and look at all the values on the site. And that gets to what Tom was saying. You can't replace being out on the ground and making these decisions on the ground and not some prescription that's, standard to all. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to do some tweaking and maximize these, not only Vesper sparrow, but the other values that Jared's talking about.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Sue from NRCS, did you want to respond to this as well, or do you have a new question?
New question.
Okay, then I'm going to jump to Marissa first. Marissa, what's your question?
Hi, this question may be way too precise given site condition variability, but I was wondering, has anybody developed some sort of a ratio of, say, maximum number of grazers per acre that could be sustainably used on a site in order to still support OVS and native plant populations? Or is it just really about kind of rotation and partitioning and that sort of thing?
No.
Yeah, to me, I mean, these guys could maybe answer better, but it's pretty much site by site. There's so many different variables out there that have to be recognized. And so Tom may have some thoughts, but
I think your soil is a good starting place. If you look at the Web Soil Survey, the most productive soils in the Willamette Valley, you're getting 10 to 12 animal unit months per acre, and then you get into those foothill soils, and then your maximum productivity is maybe 4 animal unit months in a year. It's just so site specific. It looks like Derek has something you wanted to add.
There are so many variables. I mean, and your recommendation, Tom, to start with that 50% of the scoring makes a lot of sense to me based on my almost 3 decades of playing with cattle here. But it also another variable would be, what kind of cattle do you have? Are they 600-pound yearlings? Or is it a mother and a calf? Is it a young calf, an older calf? I mean, so there is just a multitude of variables. And how much moisture have you had that year? I mean, we're dealing with that this year as a fairly dry year. We're having to make some adjustments, and we're always doing that. And our rotation here varies. When we first start getting cattle here, end of February, 1st of March, weather dependent, we only have a fraction of what we will run during the May, June, 1st of July part of the season. We might only be in a pasture for half of a day early in the season and then move on and make a rotation on the entire ranch in 3 weeks. And towards the end of the season, when it's growing faster, we kind of have to maybe let some things go to seed because we can't keep everything eaten off short enough. And forgive me if I'm rambling. I just want to make that point that I'm out there every day, walking around, watching, looking what's going on and making decisions almost on a daily basis on where we can be. We decided to run 70% of the numbers that we think we could run here every year. So we had cushion. So in a year like this, we didn't run out of feed, which is an economic disaster if we let that happen here. So that's just some of my input as a producer.
Thanks. That's all really great. Sue, did you want to ask your question?
Livestock producers may want to know roughly how productive native grasses are. A botanist once told me that natives were about 1/3 as productive as introduced grasses. Do you agree? Anybody?
So just anecdotally, Sue, I haven't seen any numbers, but that sounds like a reasonable number to me. I was going to guess 50% as productive, but you know, it's, yeah, you're going to have lower productivity just from what I was trying to describe by desirable forage species in the width of the leaf blade versus something that has a narrow leaf blade and more stem to it.
Okay, we've got a question from Jason. He says, for Bob and Gary, does the Vesper sparrow or other grassland birds have a preference for sharing the pasture range with one type of livestock over another?
I guess I'm unmuted. Yeah. I have not seen anything. Again, I think the most important thing is the condition of the habitat from their perspective, the structural features that are there. How you get to those structural features is somewhat independent from their preferences. Now, there is certainly differences in terms of how sheep graze and how cows graze and how horses graze. And you'd have to take those things into consideration. But if you can, considering the differences among those animals and how they graze, if you can get to the point of the habitat conditions that I described, then my answer would be no, that it doesn't matter what the animal is. Now, the challenge may be in doing that with certain, I'm thinking of sheep in particular. Maybe one of these guys could, speak a little bit more on that, but I think it would be more difficult with sheep to achieve the structural diversity. But that's just my observation. Maybe somebody else knows a little bit more about that. But I think it's really more about getting the conditions, not which animal does it.
I guess I prefer cattle just because they're a little bit more indiscriminate and they really like the grass and they're really good at getting a lot of biomass off of there quickly. Whereas something that might browse a little bit more probably is gonna go after the flowers maybe a little bit more. But Vesper sparrows might disagree with me on that. So that's just my thought from my observations.
Anyone else want to add to that, or think that good enough answer? Tom?
I agree with Jared. That's just for what he was saying. They will slick off a field and be more indiscriminate, and they do like the grass, and the wildflowers is what we want. That's always been a concern of mine. If you have a browser in the field that likes the leafy plants or as opposed to grass, are you going to reduce that forb diversity? But yeah, I think Jared had a good answer.
One of the nice things about sheep is you could probably utilize them a little bit more in the winter time. One of the most remarkable prairie restorations I've seen was utilizing cattle in the spring and summer and then coming back with sheep in the winter. And this particular producer took a 30-acre field that was solid reed canary grass and managed to turn it into this beautiful prairie with not a drop of herbicide. And it boosted a Bradshaw's desert parsley population. And sadly, Greenbelt Land Trust, it doesn't look like it's going to be managing that property. But it was quite an eye opener for me. So I think sheep would be a good thing to consider in the winter, because there's a lot of the natives are underground, so the sheep can't target them as much.
Great. Other questions? Marissa and Sue, you both still have your hands up, so feel free to unmute if you have a new question, but otherwise I'll assume that's just your initial question. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think I'd love to just ask our panelists if they have any other things they want to add, and then we might let people get to their lunch breaks.
One of the things that I really love and enjoy the most is creating prairies from scratch. And so thinking of new and creative ways to kind of rethink how we seed prairies and the mechanics of how we create these prairies. And so often, some of our first objectives are to just get some cover on the ground. Let's focus on the native component. And I'm thinking on the fly here, so this is just a creative way. If we can work backwards and we can think about the structure that at least Vesper sparrows are looking for, is there a way to rethink, should we be planting, should we continue to plant the same way that we've always planted? How can we do it a little bit different? If we cannot burn our fields and we really do see a future for grazing, is there a way that we can incorporate some non-native forage grasses into our planting designs, which is heresy in many ways. But like I said, I'm thinking off the fly here. Like, what if you have a drill with 12 rows, what if 4 of those rows have non-native pasture grasses in them, and the others there's a couple natives mixed in and a really high wildflower mix in the rest, and we rely on cattle grazing to keep that tall fescue and perennial rye grazed down, so it's not overpowering the field. I just thought of this right now, but just a thought.
If we go that route, can I suggest we don't have bent grass in the mix?
I think that would be wonderful. I'm just, like I said, throwing out this random idea, but since we had time, I like planting fields, and I think we have learned and evolved over the years on how we plant our fields, and just thinking of yet another creative pilot project.
Yes, I would add to that a little bit, Matt. You know, I'm distinguishing general prairie restoration from Vesper sparrow conditions and what they desire. And so the challenge, what I've always seen from most of the prairie restorations, is meeting that sort of sparsely vegetated conditions. It seems to be the greatest challenge, again, from a Vesper sparrow perspective. And so, and I don't have an answer, obviously, but I think if the objective is Vesper sparrow conservation, that might be one of the higher priorities, is how are you going to do that part of it? And of course, that's what cattle can do. And so if the cattle grazing can be incorporated into that prairie restoration such that it's not only doing the things that you just said, but also at the same time inadvertently creating some of these bearish spots, which of course are going to, without anything being done, are going to attract weeds and attract non-desirables in a prairie restoration. But still, we need to have some of that in order to mimic the historic conditions that were provided by these interstitial spaces between bunch grasses, where they didn't have heavily competitive annual, non-native grasses that we have now. So to me, that's always the challenge from this bird standpoint and prairie restoration. It can get too thick in there, and there's just not enough of that sparsely vegetated area, unless you're in a situation where you've got thinner soils, where the thinner soils are going to naturally inhibit some of that plant growth. And, we talked about some of those places earlier, some of those hillsides and other places where you've just got rocky or thinner soils that maybe they meet that need, and then you don't really have to worry about the invasion coming in and thickening everything up. So it's a challenge. I don't, I've keep rattling. You and I have had this conversation before. How do we get that within our normal prairie restoration? And it's something to work on, I'm sure.
So yeah, Bob, I would just follow up on that bare ground, because I do think that is always the hardest thing that we're trying to sort of achieve for whether it's larks or vesper sparrows. In South Sound, we always talk about this sort of potential link with creating habitat, in areas where we have those critters that will create bare ground for us, gophers being the species we're thinking about, and really trying to tie, one listed species with another species in peril, tying that conservation together. So I think that's one area here in South Puget Sound that I know we can work in. I'm not as familiar with where gophers and other burrowing critters in the Willamette Valley and other regions would be, but certainly in South Sound, like that is a bare ground producing mechanism that can help us out.
I'm gonna let Kathy ask her question.
I'm actually not going to ask a question. I'm just going to have an observation. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So everybody knows how much I love California oak grass, or anybody who knows me knows that. I have actually seen it out in otherwise tall fescue pastures. The cattle will seek it out. It's got a high protein content. And that's the other thing. Our native species do actually, for the most part, have pretty high protein content. So they are desirable forage for the most part. Some species produce more than others, but California oak grass is a lower growing kind of bunch grass. It's got really good high protein content, and the cattle will seek it out in a ryegrass field, in a tall fescue, especially a tall fescue field. It is tasty. If you go look in those areas that have gotten eaten down to nothing and take a closer look. You've got remnant California oak grass in a lot of those fields out there. So I would advocate, using that in this kind of scenario. We're trying to make more habitat for those upland bird or grassland birds. I think would be a real good component, and forage value.
That's my observation with California oak grass is that lower growth point, like Tom was talking about, where I've noticed it outside of a pasture situation is that in places where trails are mowed constantly through prairies, they're typically mowed really low. And every single year, a lot of the natives drop out except for California oak grass. That's where California oak grass does best. Wow. And so, yeah, I think it could be a great opportunity for a grass, if provided producers agree that the cattle like it and can put on some weight.
Great. Derek, Tom, do you want to add to any of what's just been discussed or any last thoughts?
Well, I just really liked what Matt was saying earlier about the people side of things. And then Derek talked about that as well as, none of this is going to happen without building relationships with people. And I see a lot of agency and SWCD folks on the list here. If I were to walk onto a farmer's place and say, man, you're doing it all wrong, you need to do this, this, and this, they would never have me out there again. I start out by asking questions and probably ask too many questions sometimes, but I've learned so much from talking with producers. Ryan Cheek was mentioned a couple of times. I've worked with him for like 15 years now, and he is a great one to ask questions of, and that's part of where my strategy from grazing timing and what's reasonable came from working with him. And I just want to just reiterate that, I don't think I said it today, but I know I said it last time, that there aren't enough protected lands to delist these species. The only way they're going to be delisted is working with private landowners on working lands and figuring out ways that habitat and agricultural production can coexist hand in hand. And that's not going to happen without those relationships with the individuals.
And that was kind of my closing thought. It's going big picture like that. There just seems to be fewer and fewer ranchers all the time. These lands are especially vulnerable when there's generational turnover, especially, if the land gets sold or something like that. It's not an easy business to be in. And anything we can do to give landowners the option or the incentive to continue grazing, we really need to do that. So, things like the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program, that's potentially going away, likely going away here in the next few years. What's the plan after that? I'm sure Kelly Reese and the folks at BPA have that figured out, but I don't know what the answer is to that. And Derek, if you wanted to be out of the cattle business and you didn't have a conservation easement, what would you be doing there?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about as you were talking and as Tom's been talking. And I guess I'm compelled right now to just blurt this out, maybe as encouragement. There may not be as many of us, but our family will be a loud voice to say that our operation is more profitable, more effective, and more enjoyable because of the partnerships that we've had from the agencies, the technical support that we've had. We have people like Jared and Tom and Saunders that understand, and they try to help us, and it has helped. And I'm trying to give back here on this ranch by raising the next 2 generations of people that have the desire and the ability to do this and have it make money for them so it's sustainable. And if that doesn't happen, all of this goes away. And that would be tragic in my perspective. And again, Elsbeth, that's why I invite anybody that I love giving tours here. I like to talk to people about this and wrestle through some of the challenges, but we love it. I'm not sure if that's smart or not, but we do. And I'm sure I always will. And I thank you for helping us very much.
Yeah, and I'll just, add, if you're on this webinar and you're listening and you know a landowner who you're trying to form a relationship with, or you have one but they're skeptical, let me know. Send them my way, because we hope either later this year or next spring to get so a lot of ranchers and private landowners out to Derek's, just to say, hey, come see what it's about, and here's a good example. And so let us help you inform them and build that relationship and give them, an opportunity to see where this is happening successfully. And Derek is just a wonderful resource to the conservation community, because he is proof of what happens when a family loves their property and has great relationships with the conservation partners, and it can be so successful for everybody. So I just want to thank you, Derek, again for what you and your family do on your property and have contributed to conservation. I want to thank you all for being here. I hope you learned a lot. I hope it made you think about some things. I'll send out another survey to ask for feedback, and we will continue to try to have events, hopefully more in person, coming soon, to talk about the subject, to help form those relationships, and to get just more creative and make sure we're utilizing these private lands to keep them as working lands and to move conservation forward. So with that, just thank you everyone for presenting, for listening, asking great questions, and we'll look forward to talking to you in future venues. And the CPOP conference is on for this October. Abstracts are due May 27th. I will send information about that in the follow-up email, but I encourage folks to attend and participate in the conference. And with that, have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.